So we just start now because there's an awful lot that we need to pack in today. So welcome everyone. Thank you so much for coming, especially because I know that at this time of the year it's kind of hard to stay awake this late and sort of like try to pay attention to all the things. So thank you so much for coming. This is the third and last of a series of webinars that we've organized with the Scottish Forestry and SAC. They're all about agroforestry. So hopefully we would have given you a lot of information throughout. So the first event, we focus on riparian buffers and hedgerows. The second event, we talked about small nurseries. We talked about the Woodland Carbon Code. And why do I always forget the first one? Why do I forget linseed? No, we're not forgetting it. It's just animals and trees and the importance of trees for animals and how you can diversify your farms. And this last one, we're going to be focusing on things that how trees can help you diversify your farm, this time focusing on what you can get from trees. So we're going to be talking about coppicing, we're going to be talking about fruit trees, and we're going to be talking about timber. So we have three amazing speakers today. I'll let them introduce themselves properly because I'm really bad at doing that usually. But just for you to know who they are, I'm going to ask them to wave. First, Grant, I see you first from Knoydart, from the Knoydart Forest Trust. Then I can see Catherine from Megginch Castle, who's like all things absolute apple extraordinaire. That's her thing. And then Al Whitworth. I'm rubbish today. Sorry, I'm having a very Latin American moment. Speaking really badly. And he's going to be talking all things Croft and how you can do coppicing, focusing on coppicing, but other things as well. If you have any other questions about Croft's entries, he's a person to talk to. So I'm going to kickstart this with Al. Al, would you like to be the first one? Are you okay being the first one to go? And again, as I mentioned, it's going to be super conversational. So the idea is for you to be able to ask questions on the chat, but also ask questions raising your hands. And even though I have a few slides that I'm going to be sharing with you for about what Al's going to be talking about, again, it's going to go through questions. So Al, I'm going to start sharing, and then we can go into the conversation. So see, is that already showing? It's always a bit rubbish.
Yep.
So as I say, we're going to be talking all things coppicing with Al. So I guess that we can just start with some questions if that's okay, but it would be great if before doing any questions, proper questions, you could introduce yourself a little bit and tell us what you do in the Croft, and then we'll move it from there.
Yeah, sure. So I'm Al.
Hold it 1 second. I'm going to just mute Jerry really fast. So, sorry, go ahead.
Yeah, I'm Al, and my wife and I are all Croft and coast in between Tug and Betty Hill, at a place called Skerry, and we've been up here for 4 years now. It's a little 8-acre croft, and we're trying to grow our own food and simply on the croft. And
you're sorry, Al, you're a bit muted. Could you just get a bit closer to the computer, please?
Okay, I shall.
There we go. Sorry about that.
That's all right. I'll speak up a little bit. Yeah, so we have an 8-acre croft in the north coast, and we're growing our own food and firewood and things like that. It's a woodland croft, so we have about half of the croft at the moment is planted with trees, which was done by the previous tenants of the croft. So we inherited it as about 15 to 20-year-old trees. Some of them a bit less than that. So it was a real kickstart for us. And that's why we went for it. So we're in a great position to start working with some of the trees. Some of them are big enough to cut and harvest. We've got trees as well. Doing a bit of everything. Aurora is a basket maker as well. So we're something she's just started in the last year and a half, and now focusing on that as a main work. And so we're trying to grow a lot of our willow for that as well. Trying to get more of planting a lot at the moment.
That sounds great. I'm going to be sharing your link in a second to your website, which is amazing, and you can sort of like have more ideas about what you're doing in practical terms. But moving into coppicing first, just for people like me that have a vague notion of what coppicing is, but not necessarily an awful lot, could you explain what coppicing is and why it's important?
Yeah, sure. So coppicing, so you can see the picture in front. That's an ash tree that has been coppiced. Basically, what it means is cutting a tree down to the ground, and it generally broadleaf trees in the UK will resprout and regrow from the stump, grow back into
Sorry,
trees
one
again.
second. I'm getting a bit of feedback from Rudy. Wait 1 second. I'll just mute poor Rudy, and then we can continue. Sorry about that.
So it's a way of managing trees, really, and keeping them fairly small and keeping them of a small size that you can manage with smaller tools, hand tools, for example. And it's a very traditional technique that has been used for centuries, even millennia, to get different products, different size products from the trees and various different products that are then made into other things. Been kind of long forgotten, really. It's been kept active in England, but up in Scotland, not so much. Not so much for history of thing recently.
And how did you get involved in the whole coppicing world? Because I mean, it's something that I hear a lot people talk about it, but not necessarily get involved in, let alone creating an association like you have.
Yeah, so I'm far from an expert in coppicing at all, but what got me into it is having come to the Croft here. I was in Shetland before, didn't have a great deal of experience with trees in Shetland, on my parents' croft up there. So I was really starting from not a great deal of knowledge at all. And it just made sense as I looked into tree management and woodland management, how to work with what we had here on the Croft, that coppicing is on a much shorter rotation generally than cutting trees for firewood or whatever. If you just let them grow and cut them down and plant again, that's done on a much longer rotation. So it kind of made sense as a way of keeping things the right size, but also having a regular harvest from the trees so that we could then use that on the croft and plan it and manage it as a resource, really. So moving forward from sort of shelter belts where it's a fixed thing, like seeing that as how can I actually cut them and use them, and they still provide shelter, they still provide all these other things as well. So it's multiple uses, really. So that's what got me into coppicing. And then a kind of realization that there didn't seem to be many people in Scotland that were there to ask the questions to. So I joined Reforesting Scotland, who's a great organisation, a member-led organisation, and they'd had a lot of history in coppicing, and they'd tried to start a group on it a few years back, and it hadn't quite got anywhere. So I sort of said, well, can I do it? Can I step in and can we start this group again? So just started with a Facebook group, which now has nearly 1,000 members actually, and then we've got an actual kind of coppice group now. We're affiliated to the National Coppice Federation, which are based down in England. Generally, didn't have anyone in Scotland until we joined, and we've now got, I think, 50 or something members on that as well. It's just £3 a year to join, but so we're getting a bit of a network now. We've had our first group meet, and we're trying to organise some more training and those sorts of things to really get coppicing back on the map, as I guess, in Scotland as a management method, and get a bit more knowledge out there, really.
That's great. What on a practical level, just to get the conversation started about coppicing in particular in Scotland. I guess that the first question that anybody would ask is, well, why? You've already asked, but which are good varieties? How do you even get started in terms of the variety, and then in terms of the planning and thinking about coppicing as part of your farm on a wider sense?
Yeah, well, I'm going to maybe look at a couple more of the pictures that I've shared, and I can go through that.
Go ahead.
But so this is an ash stool in front on the picture there, and I think the next picture might be one of the ash poles that I harvested off it, and that will give you an idea of the size. So it's got sort of 6-7 meter poles coming off that tree there that were 4 or 5 inches at the base. There we go. So I'm going to keep them for a building or some sort of shed or something like that. So the bigger size coppice wood is for maybe building work, or that would be perfect size for firewood to cut very easily and split easily. So you've got that side of things. All that wood there actually is coppice wood. That's alder and ash. There's some willow in there as well. So you can coppice pretty much any species, any broadleaf species in the UK. Beech is one exception that's not great at coppicing, but pretty much all the others are. Willow and alder are two that grow really well as coppice. Willow was always coppiced a lot for basketry. That's coppiced annually for that. And hazel is another one that traditionally is one of the main coppice species down in England. And not so much in Scotland, hazel coppice, but there's no reason why it couldn't be. Hazel's quite a durable wood, quite a strong wood, so it works really well for that, and it grows fairly quickly. So there's lots of things to look at in terms of coppice. If you're wanting a productive coppice with trees for a certain purpose, like firewood, then you're probably going to look at something that's quicker growing. So maybe not oak, because it's going to take sort of 30 years maybe to get to a size that you want to cut it, 20, 30 years, depending on what size you want, obviously. Whereas alder and birch and species like that will grow a bit quicker. So it really depends on what you want to use it for, and that's the beauty of coppice. There's so many different options. So traditionally down in England, where they're still coppicing regularly, they coppice a lot of hazel, which is maybe cut on a 8 to 10 year cycle, something like that. So you'd have 8 areas, and you'd cut one a year in winter. You always cut in winter with coppice while the sap's down, and that product can then be used for loads of different things. Really, is beam poles, sort of garden supports, hedging stakes. You can make it into hurdles, sort of fence panels. There's really a lot of different things that you can put that to, and that's fairly small stuff. That would be maybe 2 inches at the base, like after 7 or 8 years.
Would you say so? There's one question that is probably interesting to address right away. There's a question by Chris asking if there's any dieback in the ash, and what have you seen about that?
Yeah, I thought this would probably come up, seeing as I literally copied this ash a few months ago. We're really fortunate to not have it here on the Croft yet, but where we are in the north. But I've been assured it's going to get here. We've got quite a lot of ash on the Croft. I'm leaving some as standards, which are sort of big trees, and I'm coppicing some and just seeing how it reacts really, and we'll wait and see. There's a few interesting techniques that people are coming up with to maybe try and help with ash dieback. So yeah, it's, I'm enjoying the ash while it's here, but I don't know.
There's Chris is also commenting that the sweet chestnut is a very productive coppice in Shropshire. Is something that you can try further up, or is it something that you would say is probably out with the Scottish kind of environment?
Sweet chestnut's a really interesting one. Down in the south of England, it's generally is a productive coppice and a profitable coppice, I should say. People actually work in coppice down in England. Sweet chestnut is relegated to really the far south, where it grows quickly enough that you can make a crop out of it. So the further north you go, the less commercially viable it's going to be. So it doesn't mean you can't try and grow it. I mean, we're trying it on the Croft. I've planted some. They're about 10 inches tall. So it'll be a while till I coppice them. But yeah, it's really durable timber. So it's as with climate change, as things warming up, maybe it'll become more viable north. So there's certainly, it grows in Scotland, so it's worth a go.
Brilliant. Well, so I mean, you've talked a little bit about why do it. You've talked about sort of like what kind of varieties are good. What would you say in general is the benefit for the trees? So not for us, but for the trees about being managed that way, and what the benefits are for the land about it?
Yes, it's in terms of biodiversity, for the tree itself, by coppicing, you're just extending its life really. So it's not necessarily going to make the tree any better. You're cutting it down and forcing it to regrow, but they will keep doing that for a long time. So you can keep cutting for some trees are thousands of years old actually that have been coppiced historically. So it really can prolong the life of a tree way beyond what it usually would grow to. So there's that side of things. But if you manage an area as coppice and you're cutting one part of that area per year, you're opening up that area to the light. So you're opening up the canopy, because you usually would coppice an area at a time so that the light gets in so that they can regrow. If you only cut one tree in the middle of a woodland, it's going to get starved of light. So when you do that, it opens up the area, and the ground floor then explodes into life of flowers and all these different things that have been restricted by the shade. And as you do that over several rotations, you get different areas of your woodland that are at different ages and at different parts of the cycle. So you get different species associated with that. So there's a lot of studies on the biodiversity benefits for managing like this. But it's a man-made way of managing, really.
Oh, what I missed you. There we go. I was just wondering if you wanted to go through some of the other pictures, because I noticed that we've kept people for quite a while.
Yeah.
And I think that probably going through them, you can tell a bit of story about what you're doing in your farm at the moment and how it actually sort of like refers to how coppicing actually should happen and what could have, what's a good approach to this, and also how it looks, because I think that's part of it. Like, I know I've not thought about coppicing even on an image way, and then when you start seeing the way that the trees look, it starts making so much more sense. So how about we go? You tell me and I'll go moving.
Yeah, so if you go back to the previous one first, so I started looking at coppicing as a method of managing trees on the Croft, and part of the reason for that is that we wanted smaller diameter timber for different things. We wanted to produce lots of different products, and we wanted to reduce some of the trees as well, because they were shading out areas of our Croft, shading some of the fruit trees and things like that. So it kind of made sense for that. So if you go on to the next photo. Sorry, I thought there was one in between.
maybe it's the one after.
So this is actually a recent one. I only cut these a few weeks ago. This is a neighbour's. Oh, I've gone skipped again. But this one, I'll talk about this one. This is pollarding. So this is cutting the trees. Both those pictures actually cutting the trees higher up. So you can see the regrowth. That's 1 year's regrowth off each of those stumps there, and so it's quite incredible, the number. That'll thin out as some of them will get shaded out and die. But on the previous photo, I'd cut them at about 2 meters, and the reason I was doing that is because that area is not deer fenced. So I'm experimenting with cutting the trees at that height, so that when they regrow, they're above the browsing height. So in an agroforestry system, you can put cattle, you can put sheep into there, and they're not going to affect the regrowth of those trees. So you can get 2 crops out of that area. All the wood on the floor, which is what I've cut, that will be cut for firewood mostly for me, because that's what I need. We have a wood burning stove that heats all our water and our heating in the house, and we cook on it as well. So we get through quite a bit of firewood. So we're trying to become self-sufficient in firewood, and that's through a coppice system. Mainly alder and willow coppice is what we intend for that. And yeah, and the smaller diameter timber as well, we're going to be chipping a lot of that. So we do leave some of it in the woodland. This particular woodland is quite is a new woodland, and it's quite denuded on the floor. So I'm leaving a lot of the brash timber in there to try and improve the woodland. So you don't want to be removing everything, or else you will start affecting your woodland. But if you move on, there's a few more pictures of what we're doing as well.
That's quite impressive. I didn't realize that you could get that many shoots.
Yes, so that's a willow. I think it's a crack willow. I'm not quite sure of the species, having not planted any of these trees on the Croft. We're guessing with some of these, but it's some sort of very, very productive willow. It's quite incredible, there's the number of that. So I've actually cut all that. That was 1 year's regrowth, and I've cut it all again after a year, because it's, I don't know if you can see behind, but I've got a geodome behind there, so I don't want it shading that out. So I'll be cutting those every year, and they go through a chipper, and we use that as mulch around trees. We're trying to compost it, to use it as compost as a growing medium. So experimenting with that. Some growers down south have done some amazing work on that, shown that it works really well. So I want to experiment a bit more on that, because on the Croft as well, we have a small tree nursery. And I'd really like to be able to produce all my own growing media for that, and not have to buy in expensive compost from wherever it's come from, all over the place. Yeah. So
Makes sense.
That's another use.
Yeah. The next picture might be my favorite picture in the history of the world. I didn't realize it was Aurora, and I was like, "Al, what are you doing sitting on a stand, just throwing yourself on the chipper bob?"
This is not very long ago, actually. This is our veg production areas on the Croft. So we have raised beds. It's quite wet ground. That's why we use these raised beds. And this is a bed of wood chip. We just made this bed with 4 sides and filled it with wood chip, which was mainly willow and alder. So quite light species that'll compost quite quickly. And this is a system called Ramiel chip woods, where you cut and chip small diameter timber. So it needs to be under 7 centimeters in diameter, which is quite big, actually. Our chipper can't cope with anything that size anyway. So you chip that and you put it on the ground around plants and things, and you can plant into that. So it's a really interesting system of bringing sort of forest-like fertility and forest-like soils into your growing systems. There's a really good synergy with horticulture there. We've put a huge amount on there. We've put 4 inches of chips on that, but that's just what you do to create the bed in the first place. As a maintenance regime, it's much less than that. And people are applying that on farm scales down south. There's probably people doing it in Scotland as well. I'm not aware of any, but actually using it as their main fertility base for their farms, and they can grow all that wood chip on hedges and sort of willow coppice around the fields, so they're not really losing space either. So it's a really interesting system at the moment, and there's a great book that came out on wood chip recently by
it's going to be over the moon because you're talking about
there
it.
we go. And that's been really helpful for me to look at the different ways of you can use wood chip and bring it into the farm. So anything small, anything maybe less than 2 inches, doesn't go for firewood, and it goes into wood chip, and we can use it in loads and loads of different ways around the farm.
That's great. I'm not sure you mentioned it. I might have missed it because I was sort of like trying to think about the chipper itself. But Nick is asking what kind of chipper you're using.
Yeah, I did a lot of research on this, and we bought because we were so desperate to do this when we moved here 4 years ago. We were wiped out with money having moved. We bought a cheap second-hand chipper and really regretted it. Really bad idea. So we did a lot more research, and I bought this one. There's a company in Glasgow that import these. They're called Rock Machinery, and it was £1,800 that chipper. So not cheap, but also not crazy expensive either. We went halves with another crofter on it, so we share it, and it's really, really good. So it feeds itself. It's sort of self-feeding. You just throw the stuff in, and you're not wasting time pushing things through. If anyone used a cheap chipper before, they know how infuriating it can be. So we're now finally can produce quite a bit of wood chip in a shorter amount of time. It's still petrol powered. My dream would be for a sort of electric one off solar or something like that, but for now we're on petrol. And I bought a little tractor to tow it around as well.
So cute.
It's quite heavy.
I'm going to move to the last slide just to make sure that we're not over time, but I would like you to explain what's happening here, because it took me a while. I was like, what's this picture? It took me a while to notice that there's actually trees in that wet area.
So there's not, on our croft, we've got quite a lot of wetland, effectively, or really, really boggy area that can't be drained. It's basically flat, so we can't drain it to anywhere. The drains that are there are blocked up. So we're working with what we've got and trying to plant in species that will like it. So alder and willow are wetland species, so that's the main ones we're working with. But these are willows that have, you can barely see them because I've sort of cut with a strimmer and a scythe amongst it. But they're just sticks that have basically put in the ground. They're about 1 metre long, these cuttings, quite long. I've sort of pushed them in. And it's an experiment for me because it is very wet here. It might even be too wet, but this land is something we struggle to use for anything. So the idea with this is they're planted very close together, about 1 metre apart from each other. And we'll grow those and cut them on probably a 4 or 5 year rotation for firewood. So these are hybrid willows, a mix of different varieties that we've got from different places. Yeah, and we've got about, I think it's about half a hectare. So it's about an acre of this land. So potentially I could grow an awful lot of firewood on here, and then the willow, the tops, the smaller bits could be used for chippings again. So if this works, it could be quite a productive area, but it's more of an experiment. But on better quality ground, you can grow hybrid willows for firewood quite easily. And you just plant in the bigger cuttings and cut. People tend to cut on a 4 or 5 year rotation for logs for their stove.
That's really, really interesting. Thanks, Al. There's a few questions I still have for you, but I'll save them to the end just to make sure that we're all sort of like even timed, and it doesn't look like sort of like privileging anyone so over the other, because being Latin American, I'm very sensitive to that. So I'll leave you be for a wee while. You're very welcome to go and get some water if you want to after speaking all this. It's been absolutely brilliant. And I'm going to ask Catherine if you can turn off your camera and come over, and we can talk about fruit trees for a wee while. And in particular, apples, which are your absolute pet peeve.
Oh, I love apples. Yeah, thanks so much, Al. That's really interesting. And the ramial wood chips, that's something that we use for the apples where we can. But we've got quite a lot of apples here. We've got about, I think, 1,400 trees. And I've worked out actually there's quite a lot in our orchard. So we've got, actually I'll go back. So we're at Megginch, we're between Perth and Dundee, and it's a, I like to describe it as it's a small holding with a large house. So it's actually a castle, but we've got 250 acres roundabout. So it is basically, it's a small farm, and we've got lucky enough to have the orchard, and we also have a lovely walled garden. So we've got a lot of diversity and continuity. And so my family have lived here since about 1660, and before that it was there was an old monastery, and the story is that the monks, they had a garden which was surrounded by 4 yew trees, and we like to think that perhaps some of the apple varieties have just been grafted on from some of the old trees, so there's sort of long continuity of apple growing here. The orchard, it's called the New Orchard, but it was actually planted in about 1700, and it's 5 acres, and it's on the outside of the walled garden. We've got a clay soil. I would say there's a bit of loam that comes through the orchard, so in fact there's some really good growing there. And when my husband and I took over in about 2005, there were 91 really ancient trees and huge, great sort of gnarly trees with this wonderful bark. And the orchard, when I was little, I remember there were lots more trees, and there's this beautiful feeling about being in an orchard, and it's almost, I would say, almost spiritual, because you've got, it's wonderful. You've got the flowers, you've got all these beautiful blossoms and the trees, and even now you go out now and the birds, it's phenomenal, the diversity that you get in an orchard. We are in the garden and the orchard, we're completely not organic, sort of beyond organic. We don't actually put anything on that we don't grow ourselves or get organically. And so back, must have been about 2008, 2010, the council, the local council, Perth Council, they had a biodiversity initiative, and it was looking at orchards and in the area. So the area we're in is the Castle of Gowrie, and we I'd say in the 19th century been famous for orchards, and there's been thousands of trees in the area, big orchards, and they would be exported onto the Tay and then sent off everywhere. So there's a long history of apple growing, and then it just gradually died out with mechanization and orchards being grubbed up and cheaper imports, and probably the 60s, and then I think the final sort of nail in the coffin for Scottish orchards was probably joining the European Union, and everything having to be regular, because in Scotland we had so many different varieties. The one that we have here that was made here is called the Bloody Plowman, and that's an apple, and if you open it, it's got a red flesh or a pink flesh. And the story goes, I personally think it's a great marketing gimmick, but the story goes that that there was a ploughman who was shot for stealing apples, and as he lay dying, his blood seeped into the roots of the tree, and then the fruit thereafter was flesh pink with his blood. But it's a great story, and the apple is still selling today because of that, that marketing story. So I have high hopes that I will be one day breed another Scottish apple, and I should be able to think of some really cunning marketing gimmick to make it last for another 100 years.
If anybody has ideas, feel free to put them on the chat. We might take them on board, and we'll make sure to credit you.
So we've got, so let's see. So the orchard. So from the 91 old trees, we had a small grant from the SRDP, and that was just enough. It was £5,000, just enough to deer fence and rabbit proof the orchard, because there were rabbits everywhere and the deer were going through, and it was really overgrazed. Mm-hmm. And we fenced it in, and then we planted. I think we were given enough. Like, it's about another 20 or 30 trees, but something about the trees, and I just couldn't stop at 20. You know, that just wasn't enough. So I just kind of kept going. And then I came across this amazing man who had a cider orchard in Herefordshire, a collection. And I remember one of those things, trolling through the internet one day and coming across his site, and is called Henry May, and his site was the Tidner Wood Orchard. And he said he was looking for a place to house it. So I thought, oh, that sounds great. I'm sure I can. So I sent off an email, and he said, oh, okay, but you've got to come down in the next 2 weeks and take the Cironwood because, you know, the bit time constraint, and he's moving out of the country. So I thought, no problem. And then, of course, it was the end of January, and all the rootstock will have been sold by then. So we ended up with M26 for all of the fruit, which wasn't ideal. But at that time, I didn't really know a huge amount about rootstock, and I didn't understand how important the rootstock is. And so anyway, so we grafted it and planted it out, and we ended up with there were 384 cider apple varieties, probably varieties, and so we got at least probably 880 trees or something out of it. So that was an awful lot of trees to fit in, and I suddenly looked at the orchard and thought, oh my God, where are they going to fit? So we then put them as you know, all the way cordons like that on some wires. So that was great. So that fitted them all in. And there's something about all the varieties. And when we started with the, sorry, it's not being very cohesive, but back in 2010, when this Castle Orchard started talking about orchards, it was about losing the genetic diversity of the different varieties, and that was for me that was a really important thing, particularly because I knew that we had so many, literally hundreds of different varieties in this area alone, and that in each area around Scotland they'd have their own varieties. And it was only by growing all those trees in the orchard that I fully came to understand how many varieties there are and how important it is to get the right variety for your area. And so even though I've got huge amounts of variety in the orchard, some of them really don't grow very well, but they would probably do really well on the west coast or up further north or further south. So that is definitely one of the important things, is to get your variety right. And the other thing is to get your rootstock right, because you don't want to put your tree on the wrong rootstock because it's not going to grow really well.
In general, how much would you say you've learned about sort of like different varieties and rootstocks? Because that's a fascinating topic, but as you say, it's something that it's really easy to overlook because you're so focused on the variety.
Yeah.
Would you say that it's sort of like there's more available now in Scotland, or is it something that we need as a community to start thinking about and sort of like pushing forward?
There's a really great chap called Andrew Lear, who has been with the apples since the beginning. And he really gets the local varieties and he knows about them. And there's bigger nurseries down south. There's the Frank Matthews and also the Keepers nursery. But I say Andrew's really knowledgeable and knows the best ones for the areas. I think it is really important to get the right variety, and understanding that just because you've got an apple tree, it's not going to grow, not necessarily, just because you've got good ground, it's not necessarily going to grow really well. And the other thing I've learned so much from it. It's been really interesting. Everything from the spacing to the rootstock to the other thing I'm growing is tea, and that has been a really interesting journey. And I thought, oh yeah, I kind of know about soil, and I did environmental studies degree, and I thought, oh, I know about this. And of course, I know nothing now. I understand I know nothing about the soil, and it is so important to know and understand your soil and what's happening, because you can't grow anything if the soil's wrong and you don't know what's happening underground. And with the trees, so with the wood chips, it's really important to I've found to increase the mycorrhizal networks and to understand which ones are right for your plants. So like for the for the apple trees, they're not going to grow in the same networks as the tea plants. And it's understanding what's happening under the earth as well as what's going on the top. And I kind of feel now that I feed the soil as opposed to feed the trees. And I know it works because I'll mulch up really hard. And there was one line of trees that I had put a lot of mulch on. It was leaves, and I had one of the roofs in one of the bedrooms in the house had come down in a really wet winter, and it was the old lath and plaster with horsehair in it. So I thought, oh, I'm going to put that out on the apple trees, and I spread it thin along the row, and I think they'll take what they need out of it. And there's a great guy in America, Michael Phillips, an organic apple farmer, and he said it's with the trees, it's like putting out a sort of breakfast salad bar. They want to take bits and pieces, so you've got to give them the options so that their roots can decide what they want.
I think that Craig might like that comment, because he was asking before to Al whether he's tried wool around the trees, in his case to keep grass back. But now that you're talking about putting horsehair or other things in there, it might be part of the buffet. Just offering.
Oh, absolutely. So actually, I'm really pleased that Chris asked about the sheep's wool, because with the tea. So I started off with sheep's wool around the apple trees, because I had seen it. Somewhere that they did it in sort of medieval times. They would put sheep's wool down as a mulch. So I thought, right, I'm going to try that around the apple trees, and I tried it, and then I put it down, and I had 6 ewes, and so that year I just thought, right, I'll put the fleeces down, and then kind of forgot about it for a couple of years. And then when I was growing the tea, I thought, I wonder about that sheep's fleece. How did that? So I went out to have a look at the trees, and sure enough, it had completely disappeared, and there was, far fewer weeds. So I thought, oh, that's a great idea. So I've been experimenting over the years with the fleece in the walled garden around the tea plants, and it is really interesting. So I just put down a whole fleece, and it insulates the soil. It's slow release nitrogen. Depending on the color of the sheep's fleece as well, you're either reflecting or absorbing light. And if you've got a whole line of it, because it's all, it's not flat, so you don't have a wind tunnel, so it will stop you won't create a wind tunnel. And what I found with weeds is actually you need two fleeces, and the daggier and the worse the sheep fleeces are, the better, because then you've got all that extra nutrients to go in as well. And they for the worms, my worms in the walled garden, they kind of eat the fleece. I would say it takes them about a year to 2 years to completely disintegrate the fleece.
That's not bad at all.
That's pretty exciting.
That sounds like your soils and things living in your soils are having a treat there.
I know, they're really busy.
Yeah. I think that we've created a small panic in poor Andy, who's asking, he has some apple trees, I'm assuming, because he's asking, he just ordered some tea plant seeds. And I know that Andy, correct me if I'm wrong, but I think you're in Mall. And so he's asking whether tea bushes won't coexist with apple trees. And I think that sort of like brings us neatly into the next question, which is like, how do apple trees behave with other potential vegetables around, and sort of like in terms of how much they contribute to diversity within your farm, and how much do you need them to treat a little bit more monoculture-ish if you want to get something out of it? Is that a myth? Is that something that you've not seen? How do you see that?
It's all about the pH and what grows in what pH. So tea plants really like an acid, a pH of about between 4 and 5 roughly. Whereas fruit trees, they like it much higher. And also, I would go back to the mycorrhizal. They like different mycorrhiza. But the mycorrhiza is such a big subject that I can't even touch on it. It's just huge. So I would say no, that you can't have them together. You could plant them in separate areas, and you could mulch up one. If you're putting the tea plants in, you've got to get the right pH and mulch up with acid. Perhaps if you had pine or pine trees, that would make a really good mulch for the tea. But no, it's not going to work together.
Sorry, Andy. I was kind of hoping that the answer was going to be like, no worries, just plant them underneath. Clearly not.
No, it's all about the pH.
So going back, I think something that we were talking about earlier, which I thought was really interesting, because you've been working a lot about with tree varieties and apple trees and pears and plums and everything. But you've not only focused on the technical side of having the tree, but you've also thought about potential markets for the fruit, which I thought was really interesting, because in my head, coming from a country where we produce fruit to export, is like you produce apples to eat the apples or export the apples. I don't think in terms of cider. I don't think in terms of juicing. I don't necessarily think in terms of, I don't know, just other products that you can do, that you can develop. But I think that we were talking this morning a little bit in preparation for this, and you were sort of like talking about the cider explosion and the juicing explosion, sort of like wee market explosion that's happening. So I think it would be interesting just to hear a little bit more about what potential do you see market-wise for apples and other fruit trees for Scotland, because I think that kind of goes back to that piece of how do trees help you diversify your farm.
Yeah, I think there is a huge market for Scottish apples within Scotland, and I've always it's one of the things I knew there would be, but I remember going to a shop perhaps only about 4 years ago and saying something like, oh, have you got any Scottish apple juice? And they said, but you can't grow apples in Scotland. And I thought, well, I know that's not true, but there is a huge demand for apples. And so we have set up a group. This is with SAOS and through RIS as well. We set up an apple group, and we are constantly, it's called Scottish Apple Producers, but actually it's Scottish Apples, scottishapples.co.uk. And we're constantly asked, have you got any producers that have spare apples? Because there is this huge expansion in people making cider. There's quite a few growers I know that have planted orchards, but last year they had a bad crop, or their trees are still young, so the yields aren't very high. There's a big demand for Scottish apples for Scottish made cider, and the same for the juice as well. But at the moment, I would say the curve is being led by the cider. There's always the issue about whether a product is, if it's made in Scotland, if the apples are grown in Scotland, and that's something that we're working on, is a Scottish apple mark, so that if that's on the bottle, the consumer can be absolutely 100% sure that the apples are actually grown in Scotland, as opposed to, well, there's one apple in the whole ton which was Scottish. And trying to finding the markets, local markets are definitely a place for apples. It's quite small scale in that it wouldn't be a supermarket thing, because that's the scale of that is just huge, and we're not there yet. So it's possibly more niche things like Scottish cider, and then once that takes off, then people will be growing more apples. But apple trees, they're a nice tree. It's a friendly tree to grow. It's you can grow them part of agroforestry schemes. I think, I don't know. We discussed this earlier, and I'm sure I could be put straight on whether you can use them in the schemes currently. But you've got a lovely tree, and then also you've got the fruit which you can then use, and there's definitely a use for the fruit at the moment.
That's great to know, because sometimes it's really hard to sort of like think, well, if I don't have masses of apples, is it still worth putting them there? And I guess that's just the idea of either putting it in local markets, but also having outlets like this that sort of like concentrate bigger volumes and allows you to do something interesting with it, or even just to learn from them. That's sort of like, it feels like a very interesting approach to it. Just to make sure that we don't overrun, I think that before moving to Grant, I was wondering what sort of like, just it's one of those funny questions, but you're saying you have 300 varieties of cider apple trees alone.
Mm.
I don't even want to go into how many are others for cooking or for eating. If you were to decide on your favorite ones, or I'm not asking for one, you can choose 2 or 3, but also why it's sort of like relevant for Scotland to have this variety. Then after that, we'll move to your grant. So
I think it's really important to have variety because you can certainly, if you're selling something, you can then charge a higher price for it, basically. But also to keep the genetic variety is really important because you never know when something is going to be really useful in the fight against some disease or something. I've got a couple of apples which happen. I've stored them very basically. This one is called a Gloria Mundi. It's a cider apple, and it's not hugely exciting, but it's a nice apple, and it's kept well in a very basic condition. And then I would say
when did you harvest
flavor,
that one?
That one in October.
Oh, right. Okay.
It's been sitting in a bucket. And then for taste, they still use the Cox. This one's been in a fridge, actually. This is a Cox's Orange Pippin. And Pippin just means that it was grown from a seed. It was found as a seed. And it smells good, but it's a little bit soft. So it doesn't really keep as well. But when this is fresh, a Cox's Orange, it's an explosion of taste. It's really amazing. And this one, although it doesn't look much, is a little one called a Marston Pineapple. And again, it's a little one, but the explosion of flavour when you bite into it when it's fresh is it's phenomenal. And there's more, there's more on the palate. There's the first sort of, oh, that's quite interesting, and then there's a sort of pineapple-y sort of thing that gets you, and you think, wow, that's great. And then there's a slight, I don't know, it's really a complex flavour. I would say that, along with the Cox, and of course the Bloody Plowman.
Of course, we're never forgetting sort of like the story. I mean, I'm stuck with that for good. That's great, Catherine. There's a few questions. I think we'll go through them a bit later just to make sure that Grant has time to show us the amazing pictures that we have, but I've sort of like kept them, and we can now move. So we've talked about coppicing. That's something that you can do. You can harvest your plants. And now we're going into definitely cutting the poor trees after years and years, but doing it in a sensible, smart, planned, and very sustainable manner, which is what's happening in Knoydart, where Grant is here to tell us all about it. So Grant, you can take the floor, and I'll start showing the presentation.
Thanks, Anna.
If I can find it after bluffing. There we go.
So I'll just whiz through this presentation as an introduction. And
great.
then
You can just go and say sort of like the classic next, and I'll just go ahead.
Sure. So my name's Grant. I am a forester with Knoydart Forest Trust. We are a community managed and controlled company. We manage woodland owned by the community and neighbouring woodland owned by other people. Let's see what's next. Okay, there we are, just to the right of Skye on the mainland, but with no road access, so you get a ferry from Mallock. Next.
Wow, that's quite the view.
That's,
oh, I'm seeing it before you.
Cool. Yeah, so that's the view to Mallock on the right, and then Egg and Rum in the distance on the right, and that's our pier down there. And in the foreground is the wood behind the village, which is a lot of citrus fruit and others. And the green, yeah, next one. Next one, the map.
Tell me if I move to the next map, or if you're okay with this one.
Yeah, that'll do. So the green areas are areas that are owned by the community, or woodland areas that are owned by the community, and then the the brown areas to the north and northwest are owned by other people. So we manage the community woodlands directly through a management agreement, and we contract with neighbours and help them look after their woodland. What's next?
That's a nice picture.
Yeah, there's a bit of a time lag. That's why you get the picture before me. Yeah, so that's one of our new planting sites. So we manage about 500 hectares of existing woodland, and we've created about 500, or well, it'll be 600 or more hectares of new woodland, and that's one of the new woodland fences. All our new woodlands need fencing at the moment because of the deer. Next one. I'm looking vacant because
it's taking a while. Well, I can do a description.
So,
it's someone planting.
Yeah, so there's Danny planting trees. The interesting thing about this site was that generally our new planting is purely planting trees for the sake of planting trees, without an expectation of producing timber. Because most of our sites are pretty inaccessible. But this site here had some half decent soil and was right next to the village plantation. So we planted this with oak with a view to getting timber, and we used a German system whereby you plant clumps of 20 or so trees very close together, about half a metre apart. And then these clumps are about 10 metres apart. And the idea being that eventually you thin these clumps out to one tree. So you've got one tree every 10 metres after 150 or so years. And that oak is in foresters' terms, the main crop. But in between these clumps, in the kind of 10-metre gap in between these clumps, you've got ground for growing other things. So potentially fruit trees, or coppice for firewood, or a faster growing timber crop in between these clumps. So it's a sort of variation on the kind of traditional coppice with standards.
So is that when you say something like that, does it mean that your planning includes sort of like a variety of potential horizons that go from, I don't know, from 5 more years to 150 in the case of oaks?
Yeah, so this planting technique or planting pattern allows you to have those different horizons. So the main crop, so-called main crop, might be a sort of 150, 200 year horizon. But in between that, you might have a firewood crop, with 5 or 10 years, or a fruit tree, which I suppose is, I don't know what the horizon is for a fruit tree, but it's quite interesting, quite good fun, quite lots of scope for getting creative.
That sounds like it. Yeah. Well, I have a few questions, but I'll ask them afterwards, because in case it's not there yet, I'm seeing a gorgeous picture.
That's just a pretty picture of an oak tree. What's next? Yeah, so this is one of the 1960s, 70s lodgepole pine plantations out the glen. At the moment, its main function is to provide shelter for the deer, or at least to reduce the deer pressure on the surrounding ground. It's a relatively robust habitat, so it's better that the deer are in there than on the more vulnerable habitats. But the cost of replanting this, it might be viable to harvest this, but the cost of replanting would make it sort of unviable. So, and especially because we wouldn't want to fell it in all in one go. We'd want to fell it in small clumps, and that makes it even more expensive to restock. and the reason it's expensive to restock is because of the fencing cost. So if we move towards a situation where there are less deer on the ground, excuse me, then it would become viable to manage this on a much smaller scale. What's next?
Oh, machinery.
Yeah, so in the plantation around the village, we've got some really good Sitka spruce and some larch and some pine, and then smaller quantities of everything else. And we've got a harvesting program whereby we cut maybe 5,000 tons every 5 years. And that and most of that timber gets sold to the conventional markets. We retain maybe 100 or so tons of for our own sawmill, and we retain maybe 1,000 tons for local firewood.
When you say that you harvest it every 5 years, does it mean that you have like one big harvesting period and then you let it rest for 5 years, or is it sort of like this space is going to be harvested within 5 years and you consider like almost going through a big piece of land through 5 years and then moving to the next? How does it work?
Because we've got no road access, Woodhill has to go out on boat, and the machines have to come in on by boat. So it means that the overheads are very high. So we have to fell a big enough area to make it viable. So otherwise, if we could get a lorry on, you know, we could cut like a little bit every year and have a sort of rolling annual program. But to keep the costs down, we do it every 4 or 5 years.
And how long does it take you to cut that? Because it sounds like an awful lot of wood to cut in sort of like a huge operation.
Well, these machines will just gobble through it. I mean, a few weeks. 5,000 tons is a small job for these guys. So we try and cut as small a quantity as possible, but it has to be big enough to be viable.
And usually, how old are these trees that you're cutting?
This is mid-60s. Right.
So that's mostly, at the moment, you're mostly doing pine trees and things that would have been sort of like fashionable is probably not the word to use, but that would have been planted in great numbers through the 60s and 70s.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, it's mainly Sitka spruce, planted for timber. It grows really well, produces really usable timber. But if it's planted and managed on a clear fell regime, then it's got all the sort of negative connotations of landscape impact and soil disturbance and everything else.
That makes sense.
So the general principle of our harvesting is that we're harvesting the stuff while it's still got some value before it blows down, and then restocking it with something that we hope will be more useful to the community and more environmentally sensible, and where possible planted in a way that will allow it to be managed without clear felling in future. So one of the ironies is if you don't want to do clear felling, if you want to manage your trees under a continuous cover system, quite often the first thing you've got to do is clear felling. So,
is it just to make sure that everything is sort of like almost like a clean slate before you start?
Well, if you've got a plantation where all the trees are the same age, the same species, genetically very similar, all the same distance apart, and you go in and cut a few trees because it's nice to cut a few trees and not cut an awful lot of trees, then the rest of them just blow down, and that's fine. That's great for biodiversity, but it's not very efficient for producing timber, and producing timber is important because it's a low carbon alternative to concrete and steel and glass. So it's important to grow timber, but doing it with ruthless efficiency is bad for, or has negative impacts for biodiversity and everything else.
So when you're planning for future planting, because if you're saying that everything that you have there is probably from the 60s and the 70s, I'm assuming there's an awful lot of monocultivars there in sort of like not as much variety. But as you move forward, is the idea to start planting more diverse kind of woods that you can pick and choose certain products, or is it still going through focusing particularly in one species or one or two or three, and then allowing biodiversity to grow in the middle of it?
Yeah, basically we're planting with everything we can think of on the sort of don't put all your eggs in one basket principle. This area here, for example, I think we restocked with western red cedar, sycamore, oak, alder, and aspen, something like that.
And does that mean that you're planning on harvesting at different points throughout the upcoming 200 years if you had some oak there? Or how does it work in terms of planning future timber harvests?
Well, the general principle is if the site is got good access and good soil, then we plant something that we hope will produce useful timber. And useful timber would be this is kind of a broad phrase, but generally speaking, useful timber for us means western red cedar because it's durable, sycamore because it's fast growing and very usable for internal stuff, oak because it's oak and you can't go wrong with oak. Unfortunately, we can't really plant larch because of the risk of phytophthora. Excuse me. And the soil's not really good enough for Douglas fir, so western red cedar is the potential alternative to Sitka. And of course there'll be Sitka. There'll be tons and tons of Sitka regen. There'll always be Sitka, and that's fine. And it's a good timber, but we don't see any need to plant it because there's plenty of it.
That makes sense. Do you want me to move to the next slide?
Yeah, great. Keep me going. Don't let me.
Gosh.
Are other people getting this delay with the slides as well?
Yeah, it usually happens. I think it's sort of like just my rubbish internet. Apologies.
So yeah, so this is the school kids out planting in the restock, and they've put their names and the date on the tube. We're a community organisation, so getting the kids involved is important to us. Next one.
How much do the children learn about the trees in general, or how interested are they? Is that something that's becoming almost part of their lives, or are they just learning more about it? Because I know that me growing up in a city, I was I didn't understand trees very much, if that makes sense, and then that makes it really hard to understand the complexities in a farming situation. So for citizens, for example, so how does it play?
The schools, how involved the school is tends to depend on the teachers and how the teachers feel about getting out into the woods. The kids themselves are in general out in the woods all the time, and the kind of the thing that gets them excited is when the big machines come.
Fair enough.
And it's but yeah, no, I think we've got a quite a good relationship with the youngsters.
That's great. And so I'm assuming that the picture that you have there is what makes them sing with joy.
Well, that's a bit of a generalisation, but yes, we have great fun when the harvesters come. We generally try and get the whole school into the harvesters, and the teachers have a bit of a panic when in the whole school, which might be 6 or 7 pupils all pile into the cab of the harvester, and then the harvester sort of trundles off down the hill. Teachers start to panic a little bit. It's quite good fun.
Oh gosh, I wish I had grown there. That's amazing. So on a more serious note, can you tell us a little bit about what's happening here in sort of like in terms of the whole process? And probably this is a good moment as well to try to understand how you're managing the timber there, because as I understand it, based on everything that you've said, you harvest every 5 years, and you go in one big boom, and you harvest. So you bring the machinery cuts all the trees and everything. But what happens after that? Is it just harvesting, putting it on a ship and delivering it, or is the goal to start sort of like creating more of the production of the final product in Knoydart and then moving out?
Yeah. So the harvesting program is determined by the woodland and the needs of the woodland, and we can't really do much about that. The woodland, in order to restructure the woodland and prevent it blowing down, and in order to plant new species, basically we have to cut roughly 5,000 tonnes every 5 years, and what we do is we retain a percentage of that for local use, and the rest gets sold off to the market. And if we're lucky, then we make money on that. And recently the prices have been getting better, and it's definitely a money making thing at the moment. Didn't used to be. And so we retain, when we fell, we retain all the larch that we cut, because that's the best firewood and the best for milling, and we retain some spruce, and then we mill that stuff and sell it either off the saw for cladding and sheds and that kind of thing, or we have a kiln and a planer moulder, so we can make flooring and paneling and that kind of stuff. We, just before COVID, we produced all the flooring for our renovated village hall. So I can't remember, what was it, 120 square meters? Is that to 10 by? I can't remember, something. So we can do flooring, that kind of thing. And we've recently bought a new wood miser sawmill, which we're installing at the end of this month, and that'll allow us to kind of ramp up production. And the way things are at the moment, the price of woods is going up and up, and we'll have no problem selling the sawn wood. Did that answer your question?
I think that's really interesting, especially considering for sort of like smaller farms, your model in terms of coming together as a community and having all this bigger machine and sort of like concise, like one person that has all the know-how and that can share it with the community is probably something that might be of interest for everyone coming here today.
Yeah, I mean, so a lot we do, what we do is kind of specific, because we don't have a road. But one of the main things that we do with the woodland is use it as a base to do stuff for other people. So we do a lot of contract work. We do a lot of planting for neighbouring landowners. We mill wood and sell firewood for neighbouring landowners. Just having the wood, having the space, having the equipment to manage our own wood allows us to sell our services to the neighbours.
So it's not only what you're growing on the land, you could actually have the know-how for the area. That's really interesting, because I think one of the challenges that many people that would love to have, which is on the farms have, and that might have the know-how, is, well, volumes. At the end of the day, it's a challenge. So understanding how to bring smaller groups together to create big volume, a little bit like with the apples and being able to create a market, with the coppicing and being able to wood chip everything around you, Al, that sort of like can be interesting.
Yeah.
I'll continue moving along. Oh gosh, right. delay people. I'm sorry, I'm seeing the picture that you're about to see, which is a very shocking wall of wood. You have it, Grant?
That's just a very neat stack of timber.
Is this your showing off moment, Grant?
No,
Tell
that's
us.
not me. No, that's the professionals, the full timers. That's the.
That's very impressive. And is that sort of like, for example, that would be one harvest?
That's just a fraction. That will be, there's probably a boatload there. It might be 500 or 600 tons. So we might do.
How many
10 of them.
boatloads would you usually take out every time that you have one harvest?
The last time the boats were 600 tons at a time, and I think there was seven, 6 foot that goes into. Yeah, it might have been 7 boats, maybe 600 or 650 tons at a time.
Great. And I think that we're moving into the final part of this early discussion. Then we're going to open it to questions. But I see that you have the uses of the wood now.
Yeah. Hi.
Tell us all about it. What's that?
Here we go. Okay, so here's our shed. That was when it was brand new. Those are firewood crates, a bit like potato crates. So we fill those with firewood and dry them in the shed and sell them. Sell the wood in the box. What's next?
This is Al's golden dream.
What's next?
I think it's the chopping.
Oh yeah. Okay, so there's the firewood machine. Wood in one end, firewood out the other. Dead efficient, dead easy. What's next?
You tell me when it loads.
Yeah, yes, I'm still looking at a firewood machine. You tell me what the picture is and I'll talk about it. I can't remember what comes next.
It's you actually using a saw,
right.
I think.
Okay,
I'm not sure if everybody else can see it now, but.
Yeah, so I can see firewood boxes. There's me on the wood miser. Yep, so wood miser's a great thing, and cladding is the easiest thing to cut and easiest thing to sell. There's always demand for cladding. What's next?
The next picture, which is taking a wee while to load, is you with the big machine. Which I'm not sure what you're doing with that thing.
You could probably just keep clicking, and I'll keep up with the pictures because I'm still looking at myself, which is.
I think I'll move all the way to the workshop so that you can tell us a little bit more about this.
Okay, so the last picture was the small wood products. So we do a range of things to sell in the shop to visitors, like chopping boards and spatulas and things like that, mostly from bits of hardwood. And that does quite well. It's amazing what folk will pay for a nicely made chopping board. And this is an example of kind of activity holidays. So that's some German stag party on the bottom right making stool. The risk assessment is quite interesting when they turn up with a bottle of whiskey on the bottom one, and then you give them an axe.
That must be an interesting day for risk assessment, yeah. So basically, you're doing things with wood across the board, from a wooded sort of like spoon all the way to houses, basically. Yeah,
from spoons through kind of local sawn wood for local small projects, up to thousands of tons to BSW or Ireland or somewhere.
That's really impressive. And how does the community sort of like has it changed the way that the community feels about or understands timber in general, or feel about, like, how do trees? Yeah, I guess my question is, how do trees connect with the community at this point, considering how important
it definitely feels like we're developing a woodland culture, if you like. When we first started out, the folk that were interested, and then everybody else just weren't interested. But nowadays, it's more sort of folk are generally interested in the sort of various aspects that we do, and get involved. You know.
That's great. I think we've made it, and we still have time for questions for everyone. So I'm going to start with a question for you, Grant, because I think it will nicely finish everything. And I see Al turning on his camera. So Catherine, if you can do the same thing. But I think it's kind of funny how the questions are there, which is Catherine at the very beginning asked if you ever use horses for extraction. And then Nick asked about machinery and funding to buy it. So I guess that both sides of the sort of like the technological divide from horses to machinery, and how do you use them and how do you fund them?
Cool. My first job when I first came here in whenever it was in the 1990 something, we thinned a larch wood to make fence posts for our first woodland creation scheme, and we used the hill ponies for that. I have no idea if it was cost effective, and we haven't used them since. It would be difficult here because we don't do that much. You know, there might be a few weeks' work every 6 months or something. So, and it's not really fair to bring horses across the water on a boat for the sake of a few sticks.
That makes sense. And going to the other side, I know that Lynn just posted an article with a story about how you are funding basically the sawmill. But I think it would be nice to know how did you have to get together with the community, and how did you come to the decision of applying for a grant, and whether the process was, how was the process?
Yeah, so we've had a wood miser since 1999. There was an old guy in the village who, it turns out, we didn't know at the time, but it turns out that he had terminal cancer, and he was tidying up his affairs, and he wanted to and he gave us some money to buy a wood miser. So we got, he gave us sort of 50% of the cost of buying a wood miser, which was great. That wood miser is now pretty much worn out, and we realised that the SRDP grant, that we might be eligible for that, to get an upgrade that would allow us to increase production. And interestingly, we decided to get an electric one, which is a bit of a risk, because we've got our own hydro that does the village. It's about 280 kVA hydro, and it's not absolutely guaranteed that the hydro will be able to cope with this thing, because it's got a fairly large electric motor which starts and stops every time you cut a piece of wood, and it'll be interesting to see how that pans out. I don't. We are pretty confident that it will work, but it's great that we've got an electric wood miser now. I'm delighted that we're not messing about with a diesel wood miser anymore.
We'll keep everyone informed about how it goes then. It sounds like it's sort of like an open discussion still. Lynn, you didn't hear this. Lynn's the Scottish Forestry person here, so we'll keep you informed, Lynn. Al, I have a question for you that we didn't manage to answer at the very beginning, and I think that is really crucial, because we've seen how Grant is sort of like Grant and the community are managing to make all this profitable, especially as the prices of timber go up. But how is coppicing profitable? Does it make sense to do it, or is it something that you do for the health of your farm, and therefore it would be profitable, but in a wider sense and on the longer run?
No, absolutely, it can be profitable to do it on different rotations. It really depends what your product is and what your market is. So I haven't got any examples of it being profitable really on a Croft scale, but certainly there's a guy down in the Glasgow area around there who's coppicing hazel and selling the product. He uses a lot of volunteers and integrates it with his forest school type sort of systems to bring people in to help with it. So you've got the labour. But no, it can be profitable to cut for coppice, definitely. And I think it's a great market for firewood as well, as a great way of producing firewood on a much quicker rotation in a smaller area of land. But it's more the diversity of it, really. You can produce a lot of different things, and you can multi-use the area. You've got agroforestry where you can put sheep in or chickens in or other things to stack the functions of it so that the profitability can increase that way.
And I guess that's an interesting way to sort of like lead smoothly into Catherine and asking the same question. Are apples profitable, or can they be in a smaller scale?
Yeah, definitely can be. They it's there's just so many I say there's so many different outlets. You've got the wood and you've got the fruit off the trees, and there's a farm over in Fife, and they've planted them in alleys, so you can plant them in amongst a agricultural system with the big machines as well. Yeah, and I'd say yes is the answer. Yes, they are.
And there was a technical question for you about canker, if I'm not mistaken.
Oh, yeah, so
orchard, so on a practical level.
Yeah, the canker's a really tricky thing because I think it could be windblown as well, and some trees are more susceptible. So if you opened out the orchard and let the wind blow through, which might clear it, it might also bring it in from somewhere else. I don't know is the answer. I don't know what would be the best thing to help you. But focus on, I think you said discovery was one of the varieties that actually was doing well. So I'd focus on putting in more discovery.
That's great. I just saw the little thing that said that we have 5 minutes. So before we go, I was just wondering if each of the speakers, not mandatory, but if there's something that you would like to either say, share, or any resources that you'd like to highlight. We're definitely going to be sending a mega monster follow-up email with not only the resources from this event, which I already have a list of about half a page, but also from the previous ones. This will be recorded and uploaded so that everybody can see this and the other events. But I think it's always nice just to hear from the speakers what they would like to highlight, if there's a book, a resource, or just a final piece of advice that you would just make sure that everybody has before they leave after having spoken with you. So I'm going to start with Al, then I'm going to Catherine, and then I'm going to Gran. Al, it's yours. If you unfreeze. Oh, there you are.
Sorry, muted. I've shared the link in the chat already, but the Coppice Network on the Reforesting Scotland website, I think it's very new. We really started it this year. We had last year, 2021. We had an amazing meeting out in Ullapool at Leckmelm out there, and it was really, really good. We had about 25 of us there, and we're going to hope to do a lot more training and different things this year. So, and really build on that. So I hope it's kind of a revival for Scottish Coppice, and if people want to get involved and join into that and come up with some new ideas, I think there's a lot of scope for bringing coppice into a newer area where it's got different uses. So we've talked a bit about wood chip, but there's loads of different, more modern uses we can put to coppice, as well as getting the traditional stuff back into rotation so that we're not buying in bamboo poles, we're using local hazel and stuff like that. So I'm quite excited about how it could pan out with a bit more support and a bit more conversation and getting the network going again.
That sounds brilliant, Catherine.
Oh yeah, I think Scottish. I was thinking is that Scottish apples, Scottish apple varieties are definitely a product to consider. Whatever you're doing, whether it's part of an agroforestry scheme or smaller scale, and I think Scottish apples are the product of the millennium.
There you go. You don't need another Plowman apple. That's it. You only
Pony
need
apples.
that line. Go ahead, Grant. Do you have any final idea or thoughts of something that you would really like to share with people before, even if it's like
I'm going Yeah, I'm going to invest in the wood chip handbook, and I'm going to persevere with the fruit trees. I lost, I think, 9 fruit trees to voles, I think 2 years ago. The trees were, that sort of diameter, and the voles just destroyed them. And as a result, I was hesitant to put fleeces around them because I thought the voles would just love that. But I did, and I put double vole guards on, and I better go and check and see whether
they're sneaky, those voles. They can go underneath, and then you don't know that they're there until you pick up the tree and it's gone.
I'm glad I'm not the only one.
Well, thank you so much, everyone, for coming. We have an extra minute that I can use to say thank you so much, amazing speakers. This was really not only great fun, but it was really, I learned an awful lot. And I thought that I prepared myself for this, and that was going to be like, yeah, just going through the motions. And I learned an awful lot, filled masses and masses of notes, which I'll be sharing with everyone. But thank you so much for coming. Thank you for being such brilliant speakers. And thank you everyone for being here. As I say, we're going to upload the recording. So if you know someone who's desperate to learn more about any of these topics, you can share it. And it's going to be in a playlist with the 2 previous events. So you can have a marathon of trees on your weekend and learn everything that you need to know about riparian buffers and hedges and coppicing and timber and apple trees and nurseries and just animals and trees in the Woodland Carbon Code. So thank you so much for coming, and we'll be sharing the mega email afterwards. But thank you, speakers, and thank you, everyone. And being 8:30 on the dot, I bid you farewell. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Anna.
Thank you. Yeah, thanks for hosting.
Bye,
Thanks,
everyone.
Anna. Thanks, Anna.
Bye.
Bye.